I sat frozen in that conference room, watching my boss slide a termination letter across the table just hours before my $72,000 commission was due to hit my account. Welcome back to Revenge Stories with Jolene, where the people who got pushed aside always find their way back to the top, and the ones who did the pushing rarely see it coming. If you've ever worked yourself to exhaustion for someone who threw you away the moment it became convenient, this story is going to feel personal. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and stay with me until the end, because what I found buried in one single contract clause changed absolutely everything. My name is Stella Harrison, and I had spent 2 years building the single biggest deal of my entire career. My boss, Derek Vance, stood at the head of that table with a folder in his hands and an expression I had never trusted, not once, in the 3 years I had worked under him. Security was already standing outside the glass door before he even spoke. He slid the termination letter toward me without a single word of warning. I asked him why. He didn't even blink. Should have closed it faster, he said, smirking. Humiliated, shaking, I packed my things into a cardboard box while my co-workers pretended to be busy at their desks. But as I walked toward the elevator, one single line from the client contract flashed through my mind, a line I had personally written myself 6 months earlier. And suddenly, I wasn't so sure Derek had actually won anything at all. I drove home that evening with tears blurring the edges of my vision, replaying the entire meeting over and over in my mind. $72,000. Gone, apparently, in the time it took Derek to slide one piece of paper across a conference table. 2 years of relationship building, holiday sacrifices, and weekend phone calls, reduced to a single sentence about closing faster. Then, somewhere between my third and fourth red light, I remembered the clause. Months earlier, at the direct request of our client, I had personally drafted a small addition to the master service agreement. It stated clearly that any future work performed under that contract required direct supervision from the originating account executive, meaning specifically me. Derek had signed off on the final contract without reading it carefully. I knew that for certain because he had forwarded it to legal with a single line, "Looks fine, approve as is." I sat in my car outside my apartment for a long moment, wondering if any of it actually mattered anymore. I had been fired. The deal technically still belonged to the company, not to me personally. I told myself it probably wouldn't matter. Companies have lawyers for exactly these kinds of situations, and lawyers usually found loopholes around inconvenient clauses. I walked inside, sat down on my couch, and finally let myself cry properly. That was when my phone rang. To understand how I got to that conference room, you have to go back 6 months earlier, to the beginning of everything that mattered. I had spent nearly 2 years building a relationship with William Carter, the CEO of Carter Manufacturing, a mid-sized industrial company looking to modernize their entire supply chain software. The deal, once finalized, represented the largest contract our company had landed in nearly 5 years. I missed 2 Thanksgivings working on proposal revisions. I answered calls on weekends when William's team had urgent questions. I learned his industry from the ground up, studying manufacturing logistics late into countless nights so I could speak his language fluently in every meeting. Derek, meanwhile, attended exactly 4 meetings throughout the entire process, mostly the ones involving senior executives where he could comfortably take credit afterward. William trusted me specifically, not the company, not Derek, me. He would call my direct line with questions, copy me on every important internal discussion, and reference me by name during every executive update he gave his own board. I didn't mind the imbalance at first. I told myself the recognition would come eventually, once the deal closed and the commission landed. I had no idea, not yet, exactly how wrong that assumption would turn out to be. About 4 months into the deal, Derek called me into his office and introduced me to his nephew, Ryan Decker, a recent graduate with almost no relevant sales experience. "I want you to train him," Derek said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "He's going to be your backup on this account." I didn't love the idea, but I agreed, mostly because refusing outright would have created unnecessary tension I didn't have the energy for. Ryan turned out to be pleasant enough, though clearly overwhelmed by the complexity of the Carter Manufacturing account. During one of our training sessions, while reviewing client notes together, he said something that caught me completely off guard. "Derek told me once this deal closes, I'd probably be taking over your position," he said casually, as though it were common knowledge rather than something deeply alarming. I laughed it off in the moment, assuming Ryan had simply misunderstood something Derek said in passing. But that night, replaying the comment in my head, something about it sat wrong in my stomach. Derek had been unusually present during my training sessions with Ryan, watching closely, asking detailed questions about processes only someone planning a transition would need to understand. I didn't have proof of anything yet. Just a quiet, uncomfortable feeling that something underneath the surface wasn't what it appeared to be. The feeling crystallized further during a private dinner Derek had arranged with William Carter to celebrate finalizing several key contract details. William, sharp and direct as always, refused to begin any business conversation until I physically arrived at the table, despite Derek's attempts to get started early. Once I sat down, William looked directly at Derek and said, without any hesitation, "Stella understands our company better than anyone on your team. I want to be clear about that." Derek smiled politely in the moment, the practiced smile of someone managing his public image carefully. But later that night, in the parking lot after William had already left, Derek's expression changed completely. "You need to stop making me look small in front of clients," he said sharply, his voice low and tight with barely controlled irritation. I told him, calmly, that I hadn't said anything. William had simply spoken the truth as he saw it. Derek didn't respond. He just got into his car and drove off without another word. I stood there in that empty parking lot for a long moment, feeling the same uneasy sensation I had felt after Ryan's comment weeks earlier. Something was shifting beneath the surface of this deal, something I couldn't yet fully see. The contract clause itself originated from a specific request William made during a particularly tense negotiation meeting. William had grown frustrated after working with several vendors over the years who constantly rotated account representatives, forcing his team to repeatedly explain the same operational details to new people who didn't understand his business. "I need protection against that happening here," he told me directly during a private conversation. "I need to know that whoever understands our company stays involved, regardless of internal changes on your end." His lawyer suggested specific language to address the concern, and I worked closely with our own legal department to draft a clause ensuring exactly that protection. The final wording specified that any ongoing implementation or future expansion work required direct involvement from the originating account executive, clearly defined within the document as the person who had personally negotiated and finalized the original agreement. That person, according to every piece of documentation, was me. Our legal department reviewed and approved the language without objection, recognizing it as a reasonable accommodation for a client of that size and importance. Derek received the final draft for his signature approval. He forwarded it back within 15 minutes, his only comment being a brief note approving it without changes. He never read it carefully. I would learn exactly how significant that oversight truly was much sooner than either of us expected. Back in the present, after that devastating termination, I spent the rest of that night crying and aimlessly updating my resume, unsure what else to do with my shaking hands. I hadn't told anyone yet, not my parents, not my closest friends. I needed time to process the humiliation privately before facing anyone's sympathy or outrage on my behalf. Around 11 that night, my phone rang. William Carter's name appeared on the screen. I almost didn't answer, uncertain how to explain my termination without sounding bitter or unprofessional. But curiosity, and perhaps some small instinct telling me this mattered, won out. "Stella," William said the moment I answered, his voice tight with confusion. "Why am I hearing that you no longer work there?" My heart stopped completely for a long moment. I explained, as calmly as I could manage, exactly what had happened that afternoon, the termination, the timing relative to my commission, Derek's dismissive comment about closing faster. William was quiet for several seconds after I finished. "That's unacceptable," he finally said, his voice carrying a controlled fury I had never heard from him before. "Give me a moment, Stella. I need to make some calls." He hung up before I could respond. I sat there holding my phone, completely unsure what exactly was about to happen next. What happened next unfolded faster than I could have ever anticipated. William, instead of confronting Derek publicly or causing a dramatic scene, made a single, quiet phone call to Carter Manufacturing's legal department, the same legal team that had originally requested the protective clause months earlier. He instructed them to review the master service agreement carefully, specifically focusing on the language regarding the originating account executive. Within hours, Carter Manufacturing's attorneys sent a formal notice to my former company, stating clearly that any continued implementation work under the existing contract required my direct involvement, as explicitly outlined in the legally binding agreement Derek himself had personally approved. I learned about this development the following morning through a panicked voicemail from a former co-worker who still worked there, her voice rushed and anxious. "Stella, you need to call me back immediately. Legal is losing their minds over here. Apparently there's some clause about you specifically, and now Derek's in some kind of trouble." I sat on my couch, replaying her message twice, feeling something shift slowly inside my chest. Derek had spent so much energy protecting his own reputation, taking credit publicly while pushing me aside privately, that he had never once bothered reading the exact document that would eventually expose exactly how replaceable he truly was. I had no idea yet how quickly everything was about to unravel. According to what I later learned from former co-workers, Derek's initial reaction to the legal notice was dismissive laughter. He reportedly told several people in the office that the clause was just standard legal language and insisted Carter Manufacturing's concerns could be resolved easily by simply reassuring them that Ryan was fully capable of managing the account moving forward. He apparently called Carter Manufacturing directly, attempting to smooth things over with confident reassurances that nothing meaningful had actually changed. Carter Manufacturing's attorneys, however, refused to proceed with any further implementation work until the contractual language was properly addressed. They made it clear, in writing, that continuing without resolving the clause would expose both companies to unnecessary legal risk. The entire implementation schedule, a carefully coordinated rollout affecting multiple departments within Carter Manufacturing, froze completely overnight. Vendors waiting on approval stalled. Internal teams expecting system access by a specific date were left waiting indefinitely. The kind of operational chaos that happens when a major contract suddenly grinds to an unexpected halt begins spreading quickly throughout both companies. Derek, according to my former co-worker, grew increasingly agitated as the day progressed, snapping at colleagues and making frantic calls to legal counsel, trying desperately to find some way around language he had never bothered reading carefully in the first place. I, meanwhile, sat quietly at home, watching the consequences of his carelessness begin unfolding entirely without my direct involvement. Within 72 hours, the situation had escalated enough that it reached the board of directors. A $50 million client relationship, the largest in the company's recent history, had abruptly paused all implementation work, and nobody at the executive level fully understood why until someone finally explained the contractual clause in detail. The board demanded an emergency meeting with Derek, requiring a full explanation of exactly what had happened and why the company's largest deal in years was suddenly at risk. Derek, according to what I heard secondhand, attempted to frame the entire situation as deliberate sabotage on my part, claiming I had intentionally planted the clause months earlier as some kind of insurance policy against future termination. The board, understandably skeptical of that explanation, requested a full review of my employment records and recent performance history. What they found told a dramatically different story than the one Derek was trying to construct. My performance reviews showed consistent excellence. My communication records showed transparent collaboration with legal throughout the contract drafting process. There was no indication anywhere of deceptive intent, only careful, professional contract negotiation conducted entirely with appropriate oversight and approval. Derek's explanation, increasingly, looked less like a reasonable defense and more like a desperate attempt to avoid accountability for his own carelessness. The board, for the first time, began asking deeper questions about exactly what had led to my termination in the first place. Meanwhile, Ryan Decker, suddenly thrust into full responsibility for the Carter Manufacturing account, began struggling almost immediately. He didn't understand the technical specifications I had spent months learning. He didn't have the established relationships with Williams' operational team that took years to properly build. Every question that arose, and there were many given the frozen implementation schedule, landed squarely on his shoulders without the experience necessary to answer them confidently. During a tense internal meeting reviewing the account's current status, Ryan, overwhelmed and clearly under significant pressure, made a comment that immediately caught our attention. "Derek told me months ago I'd be getting her commission once this deal closed," he said, his voice cracking slightly with stress. "He said it was already decided." The room reportedly went completely silent. HR, already conducting a careful review given the board's growing concerns, quietly began expanding their investigation, now specifically examining whether Derek had made commission-related promises to Ryan before any formal restructuring decision had actually been approved through proper channels. I learned about this development through the same former co-worker who had been keeping me updated throughout the unfolding situation. "It's getting messy over here, Stella," she told me. "People are starting to ask a lot of questions about Derek that nobody asked before." I felt something shift inside me again, a quiet recognition that the truth, once given enough room to breathe, was finally beginning to surface on its own. While all of this unfolded without my direct involvement, I still had bills to pay and a career to rebuild. A rival company, having heard rumors circulating throughout the industry about my unexpected termination, reached out directly through a recruiter within the same week. Desperate for stability and unwilling to wait indefinitely while my former company sorted through its internal chaos, I accepted their offer. The position paid reasonably well, though significantly less than what I would have earned from my commission. Still, it gave me something steady to focus on while everything else continued unfolding in the background. I genuinely believed, at that point, that my involvement with Carter Manufacturing and my former company had reached its natural conclusion. I had moved on. The contract clause had done its work exposing Derek's carelessness, and whatever happened next wasn't really my problem to manage anymore. I started settling into my new role, learning new systems, meeting new colleagues, slowly rebuilding the professional confidence that had been so thoroughly shaken by my termination. Then, less than 2 weeks into my new position, my phone rang again. William Carter's name appeared on the screen once more, and I felt my stomach tighten with the same uncertain anticipation I had felt the very first time he called. "Stella," William said the moment I answered, his voice calm but absolutely firm. "I've informed your former company that I want you personally involved in this project moving forward, regardless of where you currently work." I sat completely still, unsure I had heard him correctly. He explained that he had formally communicated to my former company's executive team that Carter Manufacturing's continued business depended specifically on my direct involvement, not simply technical compliance with a contractual clause, but genuine ongoing participation from me personally. Executives, according to William, had pushed back initially, explaining that I no longer worked there and reasonably questioning how such an arrangement could even function practically. William's response, as he relayed it to me directly, had been simple and unwavering. "Then maybe you shouldn't have fired her in the first place." I sat there holding my phone, feeling something between disbelief and quiet, overwhelming gratitude. William wasn't simply protecting a contractual technicality anymore. He was actively advocating for me personally, leveraging his company's significant business relationship specifically to ensure I received the recognition and involvement I had always deserved. I thanked him sincerely, though I had no immediate idea exactly how such an unusual arrangement might actually unfold in practical terms. What I did know, with growing certainty, was that Derek's problems were nowhere near finished yet. Derek's first response to mounting pressure, according to what I heard through ongoing updates from my former co-worker, was an attempt at reconciliation. He called me directly, his voice initially calm and almost apologetic. "Stella, I think we got off on the wrong foot here," he said. "Let's figure out how to fix this together. Maybe there's a path back for you." I listened carefully, saying very little, curious where exactly he intended to take the conversation. When I made it clear I had no interest in returning to my previous position, his tone shifted almost immediately, the calm reasonableness disappearing entirely. "Do you understand what you're doing to me?" he said, his voice rising sharply. "You're destroying everything I've built because of one technicality you happen to write into a contract." I reminded him, calmly, that he had personally signed off on that contract without reading it carefully, and that nothing about the current situation involved any deception on my part. He hung up without responding further. I sat there afterward, feeling strangely calm despite the tension of the conversation. Derek, for the first time in our entire working relationship, sounded genuinely desperate rather than confidently dismissive. Something fundamental had clearly shifted, and he was only beginning to understand exactly how serious his situation had actually become. The investigation HR had quietly initiated began uncovering considerably more than anyone initially expected. Reviewing internal email communications as part of their standard process, investigators discovered messages Derek had sent weeks before my actual termination, clearly outlining plans to remove me from the Carter manufacturing account specifically before my commission became due. One particularly damaging email, sent to another regional manager, included Derek bragging openly about his strategy. Figured out how to save the company $72,000, he had written. Cutting Stella loose right before the commission hits. Ryan takes over, everybody wins except her. HR forwarded the email directly to the board as part of their ongoing review. The implications were impossible to ignore. This hadn't been a sudden, reasonable business decision made under pressure. It had been deliberately planned, weeks in advance, specifically timed to avoid paying me money I had legitimately earned through 2 years of dedicated work. I learned about the email through my former co-worker, who described the internal reaction as something close to outrage once it began circulating among senior leadership. Derek, it seemed, had documented his own scheme in writing, never imagining anyone would actually read it carefully enough to understand exactly what he had done. As our investigation expanded further, something even more troubling began surfacing. Several former salespeople, people who had left the company over recent years under circumstances nobody had questioned too closely at the time, began quietly reaching out once word spread that Derek's conduct was finally under formal review. Each of them described remarkably similar experiences. Significant deals closing right around the time of unexpected terminations or sudden reassignments. Commissions that mysteriously never arrived. Promising employees pushed aside in favor of less experienced replacements who happened to have personal connections to Derek. The pattern, once HR began compiling these accounts together, painted a picture far more disturbing than a single isolated incident involving me. This had been happening for years, repeatedly, with multiple employees experiencing nearly identical circumstances that had never been properly investigated or addressed. The board, already deeply concerned about the Carter manufacturing situation, now faced a significantly larger problem. Derek's behavior wasn't simply poor judgment in a single instance. It appeared to be a deliberate, repeated pattern of exploiting employees for personal and financial advantage, conducted consistently enough over multiple years that it represented serious ongoing liability for the entire company. What had started as my personal termination crisis was rapidly transforming into something with far broader implications for everyone involved. Ryan, increasingly overwhelmed by both the technical demands of the Carter account and the mounting pressure from our expanding investigation, finally broke down completely during a formal interview. He confessed everything, according to what eventually became known throughout the office. Derek had instructed him directly, months earlier, to prepare for taking over my accounts entirely once the deal closed. Derek had explicitly told him, using almost the exact words he had used in his damaging email, that I would never see a penny of the commission I had spent 2 years earning. Ryan, clearly carrying significant guilt over his role in the situation despite his relative inexperience, fully cooperated with investigators, providing detailed accounts of conversations and instructions he had received from Derek throughout the process. He reached out to me personally as well, sending a message expressing genuine remorse for his involvement, explaining that he had felt trapped between following his uncle's instructions and recognizing, even then, that something about the entire situation felt deeply wrong. I appreciated his honesty, even though it didn't undo the disruption his involvement had caused. I responded simply, telling him I understood the difficult position he had been placed in, and that his cooperation with investigators mattered considerably moving forward. The case against Derek, meanwhile, continued growing stronger with each passing day. Just as everyone assumed the situation was beginning to settle, Carter Manufacturing announced something that immediately raised the stakes even further. Williams' company revealed plans for a massive expansion project, nearly 5 times the value of the original contract, requiring extensive additional implementation work across multiple new facilities. Because of the protective clause I had personally drafted months earlier, and because William had explicitly insisted on my continued involvement, I remained central to this dramatically larger opportunity despite no longer technically working for my former company. This development complicated things significantly for my former employer's executives, who now faced an impossible situation. The expansion represented enormous potential revenue, but accessing it required formally acknowledging and accommodating my involvement in a way that effectively admitted Derek's termination decision had been seriously misguided. William, during a call updating me on the expansion details, made his position completely clear. "I'm not interested in working with whoever happens to be managing this account internally," he said. "I'm interested in working with you specifically, wherever that happens to be. I sat with that statement for a long moment, recognizing exactly how significant this opportunity had become, not just for my former company's desperate situation, but for my own professional future as well. Around this same time, Carter Manufacturing's announcement triggered closer scrutiny from my former company's chief financial officer, a sharp, detail-oriented executive named Patricia Calloway. Reviewing the financial implications of the frozen contract and the newly announced expansion, Patricia began examining commission reports more closely than usual, attempting to understand exactly how the original deal's financial structure had been managed internally. What she discovered went considerably beyond simple poor judgment. Derek had apparently bypassed standard review procedures on several previous deals, manipulating commission reporting structures in ways that consistently benefited himself financially while reducing payouts to the salespeople who had actually closed the deals. Patricia compiled her findings into a detailed report, cross-referencing the pattern with the former employees who had already come forward during our ongoing investigation. The scandal, which had started as a single contractual dispute involving my termination, had now expanded into a significantly larger financial integrity issue, involving manipulated reports, bypassed procedures, and years of apparent misconduct that had gone unnoticed or ignored by leadership until now. I learned about Patricia's findings through industry channels rather than direct contact, the news spreading quickly enough that even people outside the company were beginning to discuss exactly how serious Derek's situation had become. Derek entered the formal board meeting that followed with what I was told was his usual confidence fully intact, apparently still believing he could successfully manage the narrative surrounding the entire situation. That confidence reportedly disappeared almost immediately. Executives presented him directly with the damaging email, Ryan's detailed testimony, Patricia's financial findings, and multiple accounts from former employees describing remarkably similar patterns of exploitation extending back several years. Derek, according to someone present in that meeting who later shared details with my former co-worker, attempted several different explanations, shifting blame repeatedly between unfortunate timing, miscommunication, and ultimately, briefly, attempting to suggest the entire situation represented some kind of coordinated conspiracy against him personally. None of his explanations adequately addressed the documented evidence sitting directly in front of the board. By the end of that meeting, Derek's carefully maintained confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by visible panic as he began fully understanding exactly how serious the legal and financial liabilities facing both himself and the company had actually become. The board, having seen more than enough evidence to act decisively, began discussing immediate next steps regarding Derek's continued employment, steps that would unfold rapidly over the following days. Derek called me again, late one evening, his voice sounding noticeably different than it had during any of our previous conversations. Gone was the confident dismissiveness from our termination meeting. Gone was the irritated defensiveness from his earlier attempt at reconciliation. What remained was something close to genuine fear. "Stella," he said, his voice unsteady, "I need you to come back. Just temporarily. Just to help stabilize things while everything settles down. Please, you have to understand how bad this has gotten." I listened quietly, feeling none of the satisfaction I might have expected from hearing him sound so genuinely desperate. "I've already moved on, Derek," I told him calmly. "I have a new position, and there's nothing happening at your company that requires my personal involvement to fix." "You don't understand," he continued, his voice rising slightly with panic. "Everyone's looking at me right now. The board, legal, everyone. I need this to go away." I told him, as gently as I could manage given everything that had happened, that this situation wasn't something I had created, and it certainly wasn't something I was responsible for fixing. He didn't respond for a long moment before quietly ending the call himself. I sat there afterward, feeling a strange, settled calm rather than any dramatic sense of triumph. Derek's termination, when it finally happened, was handled publicly and without any of the discretion he had once shown toward me. The board announced his removal during an internal company meeting, citing serious violations of company policy, manipulation of commission structures, and conduct that had created significant legal and financial liability for the organization. His substantial annual bonus, already approved for that fiscal year, was formally revoked entirely. The board additionally approved compensation packages for several former employees who had come forward during the investigation, including, eventually, formal acknowledgement of the $72,000 commission I had originally been denied. Ryan resigned shortly after Derek's termination, reaching out to me personally one final time to apologize directly for his role in everything that had happened. I accepted his apology genuinely. He had been young, inexperienced, and placed in an impossible position by someone he trusted who had clearly exploited that trust for his own benefit. The company, in the aftermath, faced considerable internal restructuring, attempting to rebuild both its damaged relationship with Carter Manufacturing and its reputation among remaining employees who had watched the entire scandal unfold with growing disbelief. I, meanwhile, found myself in an unexpected position, genuinely uncertain what I wanted to do next, but completely certain I no longer wanted any part of returning to that environment. About a week after Derek's very public termination, William Carter visited my new office personally, something I hadn't expected given his usual preference for phone calls and scheduled meetings. He sat across from me, his expression serious but warm. "I've been thinking about this situation for a while now," he said. "I don't simply want you working somewhere as an employee handling my account. I want something more substantial." He proposed a long-term partnership arrangement, one that would involve significantly expanded responsibility and direct collaboration on Carter Manufacturing's continued growth, regardless of where exactly I decided to base my professional future. "Wherever you choose to go," William said, "I'll follow. I trust you specifically, Stella. Not whatever company happens to employ you." I sat with his proposal for a long moment, recognizing the rare opportunity being offered. This wasn't simply a job. It was a genuine vote of confidence in my abilities and judgment, completely separate from any specific company's name or reputation. I thanked him sincerely, telling him I needed some time to consider exactly what that kind of partnership might look like in practical terms. Driving home that evening, I found myself seriously considering, for the first time, an entirely different professional path than anything I had previously imagined for myself. After careful consideration, I made the decision to start my own consulting firm rather than continuing as someone else's employee. The risk felt significant, but after everything that had happened, the idea of building something entirely my own, something nobody could simply take away through a single termination letter, felt worth pursuing fully. Several talented former colleagues, having watched the entire situation with Derek unfold and grown increasingly disillusioned with corporate environments that failed to properly value genuine contribution, reached out expressing interest in joining me. Within a few months, I had assembled a small but highly capable team, each person bringing specific expertise that complemented the others perfectly. Carter Manufacturing, exactly as William had promised, became my first major client, formalizing our new partnership arrangement almost immediately once my firm was officially established. The transition wasn't without challenges. Building systems, securing additional clients, managing payroll and operations, all of it required learning entirely new skills beyond simply closing sales deals. But for the first time in my career, every success belonged entirely to me and my team, without anyone above us positioned to take credit or quietly redirect commissions meant for the people who had actually earned them. I felt, for the first time in longer than I could remember, completely and genuinely in control of my own professional future. 1 year after that devastating termination, my consulting firm was thriving beyond anything I had initially imagined possible. I had earned significantly more than the $72,000 commission Derek had once tried to steal from me, building a client base that extended well beyond Carter Manufacturing into several other industries entirely. Then, one quiet afternoon, an email arrived in my inbox from an address I immediately recognized. Derek, apparently struggling to find stable employment following his public termination and the scandal that had followed him throughout the industry, was asking whether I might consider providing a professional recommendation for a position he was pursuing. I stared at that message for a long moment, feeling something close to quiet, genuine amusement rather than anger. The same man who had once slid a termination letter across a conference table without a single word of warning was now asking me, the person he had tried to cheat out of money I had rightfully earned, for help rebuilding his own career. I smiled slightly, closed the email without responding, and quietly deleted it. If Derek had never fired me that day, I never would have discovered exactly what I was truly capable of building on my own. And honestly, looking at everything I had built since, that turned out to be the sweetest victory of all. If you've ever been pushed aside by someone who underestimated exactly what you were capable of, I hope this story reminds you that the best response is rarely anger. It's building something so solid that they eventually have to come to you. Drop a comment telling me what you would have done in my position. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to Revenge Stories with Jolene for a brand new story every single week.